Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and Island Press. My name is Jill Lemke and I serve as the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning. I also serve as a member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous communities. In addition to hosting webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. The website is currently going through a transition, so please stay tuned for updated Smart Growth news and content. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's YouTube channel. The Planning Department's website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities at planning.maryland.gov. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speaker are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the State of Maryland, or the Smart Growth Network. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credit or 1 Sustainability and Resilience credit from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, visit the APA's website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for event number 9281478. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speaker today is Danielle Arigoni. Danielle is the Managing Director for Policy and Solutions at National Housing Trust. She previously served as the Director of Livable Communities at AARP, where she led efforts to help communities implement safe, walkable streets, age-friendly housing, transportation options, and greater opportunities for residents of all ages to participate in community life. She is the former director of the Office of Economic Resilience at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Welcome, Danielle, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope that everyone can hear me okay and see the slides. Great. Apologies for the technical difficulties at the top, but I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Jill and Island Press and University of Maryland for the invitation. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share my thoughts with y'all. Roughly 22 years or so after I worked last with the Smart Growth Network, at which time I worked with members of the network to publish a document called Affordable Housing and Smart Growth. Since that time, I've left EPA, which is a big supporter of SGN, twice, worked at HUD and AARP, as Jill mentioned, and now have circled back to this topic of affordable housing in my day job. And so where I work now, National Housing Trust, I just want to give a quick overview and introduction for those who don't know us. We're a nonprofit, nearly 40 years working on affordable housing preservation and sustainability. We own and develop properties here in the Mid-Atlantic. We work at the intersection of climate resilience, affordable housing, and equity. And while I spend my days thinking about how to make affordable housing more climate resilient, the talk today is really about broadening that lens to look holistically at the climate risks that we all face. We're here today to focus on 2 concurrent and mutually impactful trends: the aging of our population and our changing climate, both of which have the potential to radically disrupt how we plan for our communities, but differ in the degree to which these changes are evident. For most people, but still not all, there is little doubt that climate change is real, it's here, and it's impacting our daily lives. In the US and across the world, people now endure summers that are characterized by code red air quality days and winters by either too much or too little snowpack. Extreme heat and cold are becoming more common throughout the US and across the world. Hurricanes are increasingly frequent, intense, and deadly. Extreme rainfall and wildfire smoke plagues plague parts of the country unaccustomed to such conditions. We see clear evidence of the impacts of climate change in the destruction that it leaves behind. In the US here, NOAA tracks disasters, nearly all of which are climate fueled, that result in at least $1 billion of damage. The number of billion-dollar disasters has increased each year. Since NOAA started tracking around 1980, the overall average has been about 8 per year. Last year, there were 18. And as of November of this year, we were already at 25. These disasters include the full array of wildfires, storms, flooding, hurricanes, cold waves, and droughts, and reach nearly all corners of our country. Time and time again, we see that events of this scale lead to the loss of life and the devastation of homes and communities that will, in many cases, take years to recover from. This climate trend intersects with and compounds another one that is less talked about and maybe less apparent, but will nevertheless have a tremendous impact on our communities as well. We are, as a country and as a world, becoming older. People over 65 are the fastest growing demographic in the US. 100 years ago, just 1 in 20 people was over 65. Today, roughly 1 in 6 is. Moreover, by 2034, there will be more people over 65 than under 18 for the first time ever. And that group will be increasingly diverse, with far higher growth rates of older adults among Black, Asian, and Latino populations than among whites. In 2020, the share of people of color within the older adult cohort was just 24%. By 2040, that will increase to 34%. This change represents a significant tipping point among a sizable share of our population. And yet it's one that frankly doesn't get the media coverage or discussion that it deserves. As a result, many community leaders, planners, and advocates are left with a poor understanding of what this shift means and what older adults' needs are. Part of the problem is that we lack a standard definition of who is an older adult. Is it when your invitation comes to join AARP, or when you qualify for the 50-plus retirement community, or when you start collecting Social Security at 62, or Medicare at 65, or something else? That poor understanding is also exacerbated by the fact that we live in a youth-obsessed culture where any mention of aging is usually accompanied by the word anti in front of it, as well as by the fact that older adults continue to break the mold and shatter images of what it means to age. We see people running marathons in their late 80s. This year, we saw Martha Stewart grace the cover of Sports Illustrated. And of course, we have the oldest U.S. sitting president in history. Older adults continue to defy expectations and stretch the boundaries of what it means to age. But there are some inherent truths to aging when looking across the cohort that you all know well, but which may not be well understood as yet. 1 in 6 live in poverty. 96% live independently outside of congregate facilities. Nearly 30% live alone. 20% don't drive. 1 in 9 live with Alzheimer's disease or other form of dementia. 20% need help with activities of daily living, such as seeing, hearing, communicating, or self-care. 40% have ambulatory limitations. 80% live with 2 or more chronic medical conditions. It's a shortfall for all of us when we fail to acknowledge these realities and let them inform how we guide our work. So we have these 2 massive trends underway, each of which has its own set of institutions that work to address them. Engineers, data analysts, climatologists, emergency managers are working diligently to plan for the impacts of climate change. Meanwhile, gerontologists, demographers, healthcare professionals, and aging advocates are planning for an older, grayer future. That division of labor is often mirrored in public agencies that are similarly siloed. One set to manage public works and regulate utilities, manage emergency response, and a different set altogether charged with promoting health and healthy aging. And therein lies the problem. We have these 2 or more siloed approaches responsible for tackling what are each complex problems without a full understanding of how they intersect and compound. As a result, there is too little attention paid to the intersection between climate risks and an aging population. Specifically, there's not enough focus on how and where climate change exacerbates risk for older adults and what that means for communities that are home to an increasingly large share of them. Planners, smart growth advocates, and new urbanists have a unique role to play in bridging this gap, particularly in identifying built environment solutions to tackle our climate crisis and the needs of an aging nation. After all, many of the interventions that reduce emissions and help adapt to climate change also provide benefits for older adults. But those connections aren't made as frequently as they should be. Look at the 5th National Climate Assessment as an example. It, of course, represents a critically important touchstone in helping us understand both the climate risks we face and how we are tracking towards our climate goals. And because it is so important, it's worth exploring how the nation's experts in assessing our risks with regards to climate change understand and consider age. While the report is strong in assessing equity in terms of how climate intersects with racially inequitable outcomes stemming from decades of disinvestment, displacement, and marginalization, it does not devote sufficient time, in my opinion, to also mapping those against the realities of our demographic future, one where a growing share of our people are older adults. It acknowledges that we can reduce climate risk when we understand disparities, but largely stops short of considering age, despite the fact that age overlays and compounds all of the inequities already faced by many older people of color as a result of their race, ethnicity, or geography. The blind spots that can be found in the National Climate Assessment are also evident in the communities we create. As a result of the lack of understanding about older adults' needs and the siloed approach to solving for climate change and planning for aging, we've created communities that often lack adequate benches in parks, fail to provide seating and shading at bus stops. Rarely do they provide enough safe, affordable housing that is also accessible, or enough reliable, accessible, affordable choice in how to get around safely once a person stops driving. And you definitely see evidence of blind spots in the ways we fail to protect older adults during COVID. There is so much work to be done to make communities more livable and age-friendly, and good work is underway. Largely through AARP's Livable Communities program and the 800 plus communities and states that are part of the Age-Friendly Network, which aims to create places that work better for people of all ages and abilities. But there's much more to do to address blind spots that we all have about what it means to age in place. And perhaps nowhere is that more apparent than when you think about the impacts of climate change and climate-fueled disasters. Certainly, among the largest named disasters, the one that occupy our collective memory, we see that older adults bear the brunt. Hurricane Katrina, the California Camp Fire, heat domes that covered the Pacific Northwest, and more. For nearly 2 decades, hurricanes, winter storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures claim a far greater share of older adults' lives relative to the fact that they represent roughly 20% of the population. Older adults die at double, triple, or quadruple the rate as people who are younger. This trend line and the fact that it remains virtually unchanged over 20 years makes it painfully clear that we are failing to create communities that safeguard older adults in their times of greatest need. It's not like we haven't been told this was happening. News stories almost consistently reported on the tragedy. In 2008, this tragic result was reported on the heels of Hurricane Katrina, where 2/3 of the 1,300 plus people who died were over 60 and half were over 75. 10 years later, similar results were evident in Hurricanes Florence and Maria, the latter case being one in which it was estimated that all of the excess deaths caused by the hurricane were older adults. Just 3 years ago, the wildfires that impacted California and Oregon took a similar toll on older adults. In 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida and other parts of the Southeast. Once again, the majority of people who died were older adults. And this summer, early reports about who died in the Hawaii wildfires noted that many of the first victims were older adults. They speculated mid-August that the full list would, quote, probably represent a broader cross-section of ages. That proved to be wrong. The Maui Police Department publicly lists the identity and ages of the victims, and as of early October, among the first 89 names to be shared, 65 belong to people who were 60 or older. We could spend a lot of time talking about why this is. I think it's a tragic blend of ageism, ableism, and denial about how climate change is truly affecting our lives. And it certainly is also a byproduct of the siloed approach to problem solving that I described before. But I think the question we should ask more urgently is what we can do about it. For me, I felt I could make a contribution by diving deep into the topic, ultimately sharing my perspective in the form of a book, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. Drawing on lessons learned throughout my career and even more learned during my year of research, I finally landed on 3 big takeaways. First, we have to be clear-eyed in our understanding about how climate change is impacting older adults and accept that in many cases it impacts them more greatly. This has to start with more commitment to understanding who older adults are and what their needs are. Older adults are a varied group in ages and abilities, and more racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse every year. Imagine for a moment the difference in climate-related needs faced by a healthy, engaged, financially secure 62-year-old compared to those of an 89-year-old living alone in substandard housing with chronic medical conditions and no savings. Or a grandparent living comfortably in an intergenerational home with their child and her family, compared to one who is caretaking for an adult child with a disability or a spouse with dementia. It is essential to understand the financial, health, caregiving, housing, and mobility conditions faced by older adults first, in order to better understand how they intersect with and amplify their climate risks. Second, we need to recognize that individual and even institutional preparedness is not enough. One conclusion that I reached from my research is that these tragic lives lost aren't often the result of a failure of individuals to prepare. More often, they are the result of an unrealistic expectation about what it means to be prepared for someone who lives on a fixed income, or who cares for a homebound family member, or who can't drive. They also are the result of systems-wide failures that impact the whole community, but especially older adults, and therefore must be dealt with at the community scale. Third, these and other reasons are why it becomes essential to work towards community-wide resilience. That means that all sectors and all disciplines have a role to play. Aging advocates, emergency managers, housing advocates and transportation planners, healthcare providers, utilities, and many more. This is no longer the job for any one sector or profession. It is a job for all of us. Furthermore, I believe that it is the job for all of us. After all, we all have older adults in our lives whom we love, and we all presumably hope to live in a community ourselves where we will be safe and secure in the face of a changing climate. We are not on a path at the moment to create such communities, and therefore we must redouble our efforts to build community-scale resilience. So let's begin by seeking to understand how climate change impacts older adults. While I was motivated to learn more about the topic because of the tragic death rates in disasters I shared earlier, I found evidence and observed that climate change is impacting older adults in far more varied ways. In some cases, those impacts are even more widespread than in the fatality rates I shared previously, and harder to observe. Climate-fueled disasters often have financial and health effects on older adults well beyond the deaths they cause during the event. For older adults who own their home and who have most or all of their retirement savings tied up in their home equity, disasters can be devastating. It's hard for anyone to rebound, but particularly difficult for older adults due to their limited access to capital, little time to rebuild savings, and long timelines for federal relief. Moreover, those 1 in 9 people over 65 who are struggling with cognitive decline, or those who aren't computer literate, may find the administrative burden of accessing disaster relief to simply be too hard or too complex. Disasters also impact the health of older adults, which matters a lot for those 80% of older adults who live with 2 or more chronic conditions. When roads are closed or the power goes down or transit service is interrupted, people in need of regular medical care are unable to access it. When disasters damage a home in ways that create further health risks, like when flooding damage leads to black mold, the impacts on health have a far longer timeline. And when all of those effects are combined with the trauma of experiencing climate-fueled disasters, it's no surprise that research shows that they lead to worse health outcomes for older adults. The deeper I got into researching the book, however, it became clear that the impacts of climate on older adults were prevalent in all the days outside of disasters too, and in some cases even more deadly. We are all having to learn to adapt as our new normal unfolds every day. We just finished the hottest summer on record on Earth so far, which of course impacts everyone, but not everyone equally. Climate change wreaks havoc on older adults in a more insidious and complex way. Periods of prolonged heat in particular are deadly for older adults. Extreme heat is now the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the US, killing more than all other weather-related causes combined. Heat-related illnesses lead to 12,000 deaths each year, and of those, 80% are over 60. We saw this in stark relief in the Pacific Northwest heat waves of 2021, where 1,000 people died. In Multnomah County, where the largest number of people died, the average age was 67. That's because older bodies don't process excess heat the same way as younger bodies. Fatigue and weakness from heat exhaustion can be missed because they mimic other conditions, thereby going untreated. Famously, Eric Kleinenberg documented the importance of social connectedness in mitigating these risks in his study of the hundreds of older adults who died during the 1995 Chicago heat wave. he clearly showed that lack of connectedness translates into additional risk, which is certainly more prevalent among that 30% of old adults who live alone. Wildfires and flooding also have an impact. Smoke from fires and black mold found in homes that have been flooded exacerbate respiratory challenges. Dust from drought and wildfires can increase the odds of heart attack, especially for those who are overweight and diabetic. As such, for older adults who live with chronic medical conditions, these new environmental factors increase their risk in this increasingly familiar new normal. Not surprisingly, these new and more prevalent climate conditions also mean financial impacts on older adults. Many older adults live at the financial edge and face challenges to simply afford their rent or mortgage. In 2019, there were 14 million households headed by someone 75 or older. Of those, nearly half were housing cost burdened, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income for housing. Among renters, that figure went up to 76% of people who are cost burdened. And considering what housing prices have done in recent years, I truly fear what the next analysis will reveal. But we all know that the true cost of housing isn't just what one pays for rent or mortgage. Already low-income households struggle to afford utilities. AARP reports that nearly 1 in 5 low-income older adult-headed households went without basic necessities for at least 1 month to pay an energy bill. That means that someone suffering in a home or apartment that is too cold or too warm is making real-time decisions about how much they can afford and how much discomfort they can withstand. In addition, flood and wildfire insurance premiums are increasing as we develop more data-informed projections about risk. FEMA is, of course, phasing in these changes, but it still means that some homeowners will see their premiums increase 18% every year for more than a decade. In real terms, that means that a homeowner in Louisiana would see their flood insurance rates grow from $842 a year to $5,431. In Florida, from $1,053 to $4,000. But of course, more extreme temperatures also mean more demand on the electric grid that can lead to extended power outages. Blackouts, of course, are an inconvenience for everyone, but they represent a true hazard for older adults. And when they last several days, weeks, or even months, as has been the case in Texas, Louisiana, and Puerto Rico in recent years, those risks multiply. The Washington Post article just last week on the impacts of long-term power outages in Puerto Rico paints that picture clearly and tragically, spotlighting the connections between lack of power and deaths among Puerto Ricans, especially older adults on the island. People of all ages are left without access to clean water, fresh food, and basic power. But the lack of power is felt more acutely by people who rely on in-home medical equipment, such as oxygen machines or lifts. It is felt more acutely by older residents of upper-floor apartments in multifamily buildings without backup power and who can't manage the stairs. They become effectively trapped until the power comes back on. New Orleans acknowledged this after Hurricane Ida in 2021 left such buildings without power for weeks, ultimately leading to the death of at least 8 older adults, causing them to implement new policies to require backup power in some buildings. That's related to the second big takeaway I mentioned, which was that we cannot rely solely upon individual and institutional preparedness as the solution. To be sure, both individual and institutional preparedness have their place. Each person bears some personal responsibility to plan for a future with greater risks. And institutions that care for older adults have a moral and often legal responsibility to protect their residents in times of crisis. But the reality is that there are limits to what can reasonably be expected in terms of being prepared for disaster. There are limits to what someone can do to stockpile sufficient food and prescriptions to weather a crisis, especially when they already struggle to make daily ends meet, as is the case for 15% of Americans over 65 who live at or below the poverty line. Again, for the people who live with cognitive decline, dementia, or Alzheimer's, there may be very real limitations to their ability to assess risk and take the needed steps to plan for it. And certainly preparedness is far more complex for people who are caregivers for a spouse, adult child, or older parent, and forced to weigh both individual and collective risks. Many of the stories of older adults who die in disasters tell of people who took some steps to prepare, but were ultimately overwhelmed by the conditions they were confronted with and unable to get the help they needed because the systems were strained. There's also a role for institutional preparedness. One of the somewhat positive legacies of past disasters is a 2016 federal policy called the Emergency Preparedness Rule that requires any institution funded by Medicare or Medicaid prepare for disasters. This is somewhat good news for the 4% of older adults who live in congregate facilities like nursing homes or assisted living, but it too has its limitations. As I mentioned previously, roughly the vast majority, roughly 96% of older adults live in the community. This is why the New Orleans policy I just mentioned was needed, because it would apply to buildings that aren't facilities, but rather to apartment buildings that are owned and managed without subsidies where older adults happen to live. Of those older adults who live outside congregate settings, many live with spouses, but nearly 30% live alone. And that's a more common situation for women. 1 in 3 women over 65 live by themselves in 2020, compared to 1 in 5 men of the same age. And of course, some older adults do live with and are cared for by family, but increasingly older adults are childless. Whereas 11% of people over 75 have no kids, 20% of the younger older adults aged 55 to 64 do not. Second, efforts to roll back the requirements of the emergency preparedness rule has led to a patchwork of state enforcement. As a result, some states more stringently enforce the policy and other states take a more hands-off approach. This can have deadly consequences. In Louisiana, again, following Hurricane Ida in 2021, the same event I described before, 15 people died when they were evacuated from their nursing home to a warehouse that was in compliance with the plan that met the letter of the law, but nevertheless failed to protect older adults. For all these reasons and more, my third takeaway was that we need to plan better at the community scale. If we are to reduce the impacts of climate change in older adults and account for the limitations of individual and institutional preparedness, we must work to build community resilience. That means thinking differently about resilience, both what constitutes it and who is needed to achieve it. As a planner thinking about what is needed to achieve resilience, my mind naturally, maybe yours too, goes first to public systems, policies, and infrastructure improvements. That means things like more hard infrastructure, seawalls, and levees to protect communities, more green infrastructure to better manage flooding, and a more resilient grid that can withstand extreme conditions and keep the power on. But it also includes more resilient housing construction, especially in age-targeted housing, through stronger building codes and zoning reform. Resilience would include policies that encourage smaller, denser housing that reduces utility consumption, but also cultivates a social network that can help in times of disaster. Community resilience would deliver a diverse transportation network that includes public transit and fosters biking and walking to provide safe, affordable, and reliable options for the roughly 1 in 5 people who don't drive. That both creates redundancy in how people can access services and how help can be delivered, but also helps to mitigate one of the largest sources of carbon emissions. But community resilience would also include multiple modes of communicating about disasters, keeping in mind the significant share of older adults who aren't internet savvy, or who live with disabilities, or who speak a language other than English. Many of these are core smart growth principles, but not all. Many of them also deliver climate mitigation benefits, but not all. But regardless, they need to be considered as critical elements of any community-wide climate resilience plan. And with a broader definition of climate resilience, so too do we need a broader array of sectors and diverse partnerships to achieve this future. Utilities, for example, are needed to implement payment systems that can lower the seasonal cost spikes that may cause older adults to go without cooling or heating. They can encourage greater energy efficiency in homes and the use of renewable energy and battery storage to provide power when the grid goes down. They can do a better job of communicating planned power outages, so-called brownouts, that can reduce load on the grid at peak times and suspend service cutoffs for non-payment during times of extreme weather. Healthcare professionals can proactively address the issue of climate change in the course of medical care so that older adults and their caregivers better understand the risks of longer, hotter seasons or poor air quality days, especially as they relate to underlying medical conditions. Home health aides can be trained to help their clients better prepare for climate-related risks and identify interventions in the home that can make them safer, like backup power generators or air purifiers. Healthcare facilities can more readily use mobile clinics in their practice so that patients who need regular care can get it, even if transportation systems are disrupted. Emergency managers and climate resilience planners can more explicitly incorporate aging in their planning, not just for older adults who live in facilities, but also for the vast majority who live in the community, often alone. They can plug into ongoing age-friendly planning efforts at the local or regional level. Emergency managers can serve as both a resource and as leaders to advocate for better housing, transportation, and infrastructure solutions that are grounded in the realities of climate-related risks. And aging advocates can recognize that climate change is central to their work. They can educate and train their industry and integrate climate considerations more routinely into how they deliver programs and implement policies that serve the needs of older adults. They can make themselves known to other sectors as experts and establish relationships that cultivate a greater understanding of and consideration for older adults. When these and other disciplines center their work around how to reduce climate-related risk for older adults, we create safer and more resilient places for all. There are a number of places already endeavoring to make these changes, 3 of which I focus on in the book. First of which is Portland, Oregon, and Multnomah County. They built on their long-standing commitment to become age-friendly communities by integrating work across the city and the county level. They learned from the heat waves in 2021 and 2022 to redeploy systems and programs that were cultivated during COVID to get portable cooling units out into the homes of low-income older adults who were the most vulnerable. In New Orleans, Louisiana, in addition to the policy requiring backup power in apartment buildings that I mentioned earlier, they also support a robust special needs registry and evaluate their evacuation plans to ensure that they can transport people with disabilities after finding that some vehicles can't handle larger, heavier wheelchairs. Now they prepare people for sheltering in place without power rather than evacuating as their default mode. Community lighthouses by a group called Together New Orleans are working to ensure that resilience hubs are deployed throughout the community in walking distance of most older adults. And the state of New York is in the process of developing a statewide master plan for aging that has the potential to rally its 30 plus age-friendly communities and its statewide commitment to becoming an age-friendly state by integrating climate concerns. That offers the potential to marry up the incredible statewide commitments that New York has undertaken to reduce carbon and support renewable energy and create 2 million climate resilient homes by incorporating the needs of older adults. There's a great deal of promise there. I hope that this has piqued your interest in learning more about this issue. In addition to the 3 case studies I mentioned, the book is into far greater detail, including 25 solutions across housing, transportation, utilities, and more that advance climate resilience through an aging lens. I want to thank you for your time and attention, because when we work to solve for the needs of older adults, we also solve for the needs of people on limited incomes or who can't drive or who live with disabilities. We solve for those who are overlooked and not heard because they are isolated, either by choice or circumstance. We also serve the needs of our future selves by creating systems community-wide that better account for our changing abilities, needs, and risks as we age. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, for that very interesting and informative presentation. Throughout the webinar, we've been assembling questions from our audience, so let's get to them. As a reminder, you can continue submitting questions during the discussion, and we will get to as many as we can until 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Now I'm going to ask Danielle, who has already turned on her camera, our first question. Do you know of any examples of evacuation or disaster preparedness plans that are more effective in addressing the needs of older adults that people could use as a reference?
I think that that's a work in progress. I think that in the case of New Orleans, as I just mentioned, they've moved away from a notion of needing to evacuate people all the time to preparing them to shelter in place, because they acknowledge some of the limitations with evacuation. They were the ones specifically who indicated, it was the Office of Aging there, who indicated that they learned that some of the vehicles they utilized for evacuation couldn't handle these newer wheelchairs that some older adults used. That was just one kind of weak spot, if you will, in their evacuation plan that they began to account for by developing plans to shelter in place instead. I do think that there's a need to sort of understand better what it looks like to effectively evacuate. Certainly that begins by indicating mobility needs. That can be done through a special needs registry or other mechanisms. But, I think about the people in the Maui wildfires who perished, who did not drive, older adults did not drive, would rely upon friends or family or paratransit for transportation, but that resource wasn't available in an emergency situation. So I think there's no perfect model right there at the moment for how to evacuate older adults and people with disabilities. It is, in fact, a work in progress, but I think there's a good deal of work underway.
Great. Are federal policymakers discussing these issues and the potential solutions, such as, for example, in Baltimore, we have started to create climate hubs where communities are coming together with community organizations to bring resources to bear to help address some of these preparedness issues, as well as things like extreme heat days, which we have here in Maryland. Is there a federal focus happening that you're aware of on these issues?
I do think that we happen to be living in a time when there's greater focus and resources on building climate resilience than there ever has been before. I'll attribute a lot of that to the Inflation Reduction Act and the funding available that is flowing out through a number of agencies to help buildings and help communities be more resilient. That can go to support greater, more resilient grids, more resilient affordable housing, more resilient transportation options, and the like. I do think also that there's a growing awareness of the needs to kind of understand the intersectionality, if you will, of climate risk, race and ethnicity, and age. I think there's a real appetite to learning more about that. I still see, in things like the Older Americans Act reauthorization, there's an opportunity to think more about climate more explicitly. And I think when you begin to integrate climate into aging initiatives, as well as age into climate initiatives, that's really where the magic is going to happen. But I don't think communities are waiting for the federal government. I think communities have already identified that need, are already taking steps themselves to learn from past disasters and do better with the federal resources and state resources available to them, looking to the future.
Great. Somebody's asked, should there be a role for age-oriented advocacy organizations, and what should that role be in terms of climate risk preparedness and education?
Yeah, I definitely think there needs to be. I think that, to the degree that advocates and organizations that seek to serve older adults and enable them to age well in place, need to be more informed about, engaged in the assessment of risk. And that means climate-related risk in many cases. So I definitely think there's an urgency for all manner of aging advocates to tune in a little bit more to the risks of climate change and what that means for the people that they serve. Things like the vulnerability of older adults to heat is something that stands out to me as being a very obvious intersection point. Knowing that, it can't help but cause greater awareness about what is it that older serving adult organizations can do to prepare older adults to withstand periods of extreme heat or extreme cold. That might not be a focus for organizations now, but if you intend to keep people safe, keep people healthy, keep people fed, those interventions are going to look a little bit different in a period of extreme heat. Even things about, I think about, people who live in Phoenix who endured something like 6 weeks of 100 plus degree weather for weeks straight. For older adults who are already living by themselves and isolated, they can't even necessarily leave their house in times that are that hot, particularly if they don't drive. So again, for older adults serving organizations that work to combat isolation, that seek to make sure that people can access the care and services and food that they need, being able to understand and map those risks that are associated with heat and what that means for people's vulnerability is a really incredibly, I think, important part of serving older adults' needs.
That's great. Thank you. Are there actions related to the increasing attention on 15-minute communities that will help with this issue? And should actions include the diversity of needs, cultures, and differing ages?
I think I love the notion that 15-minute cities are getting more conversation and discussion in the general populace these days. I think that whether you call it new urbanism or smart growth or 15-minute cities or livable communities or sustainable communities or age-friendly communities, almost all the time, the interventions and the strategies are similar. They're very aligned around creating more choice in how people live and how they get around, putting people in closer proximity to one another to cultivate greater access to services and to create a greater sense of community. And I think that, just as we know that smart growth delivers lots of community-wide benefits, those benefits really accrue in a very great way to older adults who may otherwise be more isolated, may otherwise have, fewer options in terms of transportation or greater transportation needs, and really need to be in a place that's going to invest and commit to ensuring that it's not just an auto-dependent community. So again, whether you call it 50-minute cities, whether you work on it from the lens of age-friendly communities or not, I think some of those same solutions are very translatable across all of them, and they certainly benefit everyone, but they definitely accrue to older adults.
That's a really great point. Thank you. Someone is asking, in a related issue, how will increased bike and ped options assist those with health-related mobility limitations?
Yeah, I mean, in a few different ways, I think. One, certainly creating safe streets for people to get out and walk can help respond to what many doctors prescribe in terms of more physical activity, right? If an older adult is encouraged to improve their heart health by walking more, that's a lot easier to do in a place that has safe sidewalks, has safe crossings, and is supportive of a pedestrian and bike environment. It also creates an alternative means for people to carry out their daily activities. If you live in a bikeable community, if you live in a walkable community, you can remain active that much longer, more safely than people who do not live in a community like that. And then I think, what we saw in some of the disaster response as well is interestingly, having that sort of redundant system for bike and ped infrastructure can actually be a means to deliver relief in ways that are unexpected. In the book, I talk about a community in Oregon where there was a bike brigade that was employed to deliver water to communities that had been cut off, where the roads had been shut because of the wildfire, but they were able to use bike paths to deliver water to people who remained in those communities. I know I live in Arlington, Virginia. There's a good amount of effort underway there and other communities to do sort of disaster preparedness trials and train people to engage and be supportive of disaster relief efforts by using bike infrastructure. So I think in those ways, both from sort of keeping people healthy and giving people alternatives in how to get around, and in terms of creating a more redundant system when relief is needed, and a redundant system in terms of alternative pathways to delivering relief. I think that's where strong bike and ped infrastructure really comes into play.
Right. And I imagine a bike ped friendly community is also more friendly for ADA accessibility in terms of wheelchairs and things like that on the street.
Yeah, exactly. Bike, walk, and roll. Yeah. Ensuring that all of those modes are feasible is really critically important.
We've gotten a couple questions about zoning, and I'm going to ask both to sort of combine them. What does resilience look like in the zoning code context? And do you know of examples of provisions that could help? And in your research, have you found senior housing overlay districts, and how effective have those been if you have come across them?
I'll start at the second question and then go backwards. I haven't seen examples of senior housing overlay districts. I think that's kind of an interesting idea. I guess what I would put forward there is that I don't necessarily know that we need to solve this problem by labeling things senior housing and building more of that. In some communities, senior housing is already seen as kind of a workaround to affordable housing requirements, where the only kind of affordable or subsidized housing they'll approve is senior housing. Moreover, I think that while senior housing can be very effective in providing for the needs of low-income older adults and creating a sense of community, many older adults want to live in an intergenerational community. They don't necessarily want to be restricted or limited only to a place where they are with similarly aged peers. Right. In terms of what does zoning mean for resilience, I think I go back to housing density as being a really key part of that. Resilience to me is both adapting to the climate future that we've got and also still working on mitigation. And so I think housing, zoning policy that encourages and drives more dense, smaller, more energy efficient housing is absolutely essential in creating both resilience and in creating more age-friendly communities. And and particularly when that's coupled with building codes that drive a higher level of performance, whether it's fortified standards that are more resistant to hurricane effects, or whether it's standards that are built to resist wildfire risk more wildfire resistant. Layering on building codes along with and on top of zoning requirements that deliver us a different housing stock is a huge part of creating more resilient communities.
Great, thank you. Asking, they've noticed with their mom's independent living and assisted living experience that they use all styrofoam and plastic dinnerware. Is this being discussed in terms of resilience and aging and sustainability in general? I would imagine. That's surprising.
I should say, I guess I'm not surprised by that. I'll be honest, I didn't uncover that in my book research, in part because it's sort of out of recognition that so many older adults live outside of those facilities. I think there's a presumption that, older adults all live in assisted living or nursing homes, and the reality is that a very, very small portion does. I think that's a perfect example, though, of how and why aging advocates in the aging industry can and needs to be brought into this climate conversation. I think it goes back to sort of not just ESG goals, ensuring that services and companies are being designed with an eye towards, or being implemented with an eye to sustainability, but just understanding the intersection between services that meet older adults' needs and the climate impacts. I think that's a whole conversation that's yet really to unfold for the most part. When I think about sort of the larger, aging advocacy groups, climate's not really on their radar yet in a big way. It may be behind the scenes, but it's not sort of part of their mission statement. It's not part of their goals. And I think increasingly that's going to be something that they'll need to be mindful of, in part because of, we continue to see the sort of 20-year trend line of disproportionate impacts on older adults.
Right. Given higher rates of mobility issues among older adults, would you consider resilience measures that allow people to stay in their homes during a disaster to be more effective than resilience hubs, even within walking distance? Thinking about heating and cooling centers during power outages, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that ends up being a really hyper-local conversation and decision to be made when you layer it against the risks that are faced. For example, it's hard to imagine, a resilience hub in a walkable community that you expect someone to get to in Phoenix, for example, where it becomes physically impossible, potentially for an older adult to navigate that space with those temperatures. In that case, it may be that a cooling center, and I would say this is the case regardless, and I do think that there's great examples out of Arizona in doing this. I think it's Tempe in particular, has sort of piloted the use of pivoting, public transit buses to being mobile cooling centers. So how do you connect transportation with the cooling needs that older adults may have? The question, what I also read in that question is it better to shelter in place or try and centralize services? Again, I think it becomes a very localized conversation, and maybe even it's an event-specific conversation. But I take to heart New Orleans learnings over time, which is evacuation is not always the solution. It's not even the best solution in some cases, because what the research has shown in terms of interruption of care, when we think about people who live with cognitive decline or dementia, familiarity, routine, predictability is critically important. The dislocation and disorientation that can come from moving someone, even temporarily, can really be traumatic. I learned of an individual in New Orleans who was an older gentleman who lived by himself with a mild form of dementia, was evacuated to Houston during or in response to one of the disasters. When he lived in New Orleans, he could kind of get around by bus, and he knew where the services were. By the time he was relocated to Houston, no public transit or not effective public transit, didn't understand where the systems were, didn't have the social network there to support him. And very quickly, his sort of ability to live on his own declined and ended up moving to a nursing home. So that has huge financial impacts and effects on people, and just their state of well-being and sense of independence. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, I guess it's a very location-specific question, and I think in some cases it's an event-specific question. But there's a need to think about both. If you're expecting people to shelter in place, ensure that there are the kind of services in proximity to them that will allow them to do that successfully.
Can you speak to any potential opportunities that volunteerism may play within climate resilience, given recent influx of retirees in the over 60 demographic?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple things come to mind there. One is there's a researcher at Cornell, his name is Carl Pillimer, and he spent a lot of time looking at how to cultivate volunteerism among older adults in environmental issues. What he realized and identified was that there were some barriers, both real and perceived ones, to older adults becoming more involved in environmental volunteers. And I think that extends to climate activity as well. When you think about how environmental organizations, announce volunteer opportunities, those have to be mindful of how older adults actually get their information. So posting it on, social media may not reach the people you're trying to reach. In addition, there was a sense among older adults that they didn't know enough, didn't have the technical capacity to be of service, or that the work was going to be too physically intensive, labor intensive to them, for them to participate. When you design opportunities and programs for older adults that are kind of mindful of those barriers, whether it's communication or physical ability or mobility, I think you're able to pull in a lot of the volunteer value of older adults that they want to be able to contribute. I think of things like there's a program called Growing Greener that has these great kind of conversation cards around climate change, and it invites discussion at a group level. It can be intergenerational, it can be among older adults alone, to think about what climate action they could take individually, either that they already do or that they would consider or that they could never see themselves doing. But it's a way of sparking conversation around climate activism among older adults through kind of a guided conversation. And then I would also say that there are a lot of groups that already are very effective in rallying the incredible power and commitment of older adults to work on climate issues. There's a number of groups out there already committed to that, the largest one being Third Act, which is led by Mona Kibben, who really has sort of, I think, galvanized the idea of challenging people to think about what is it that they want to do in their third act, in that third chapter of their life, and how can they deploy some of their time, energy, intellect, expertise towards solving big problems like climate change. So a lot of opportunities out there to do that.
A couple of people have raised issues of very rural communities. Have you come across any good tips or examples of preparedness or programs that worked well in very rural, isolated communities?
Yeah, the example that comes to mind is upstate New York, where I did a talk a few weeks ago, and it's a relatively rural part of the state, Tompkins County, and there's work underway there to already involve older adults who have a hand to some degree in the age-friendly work happening. So again, when this work is sort of approached through an age-friendly lens, you can often sort of catalyze involvement in a framework that involves a number of different organizations. In this case, it was a rural community that was committing to becoming more age-friendly, and that meant that they'd set up forums for volunteers to learn about climate change, for example. They came back from that training saying, we really need to get together in our small community to talk about, who has what sort of mobility needs. Someone actually mentioned what their animals would need, and not just pets, but farm animals. What would emergency responders need to know about that house in that community when they are providing support or service? And they took it upon themselves in a very rural place to have those conversations and build that sort of understanding in sort of a voluntary, organic way. But there's a lot of interesting work already happening around mobility in rural communities, volunteer driver programs, things like that, where mobility challenges in areas that are not served by transit doesn't mean that mobility challenges disappear. People still need to get into town for medical appointments or groceries. And often what has sprung up in some rural places, I'm thinking of Maine, is volunteer driver programs, where they're able to sort of gather and organize volunteers to provide that service. Well, those same mechanisms can be really effective and helpful when thinking about climate resilience. And maybe that means that those organizations start having more conversations about what it means to live in periods of wildfire smoke, or do an assessment of, what are people's utility bills, and what are some low-cost weatherization activities that people could undertake to lower their utility costs, for example. So I think thinking about this sort of organizations and services that are already in place in rural places and using those as mechanisms to drive more conversation around climate is a really important part of the solution for small towns and rural places.
Thank you. Someone is asking, from the perspective of an MPO, who can I ally myself with when my rural transit provider wants to cut transit routes, fixed transit, in favor of more paratransit service? I recognize it's a nuanced scenario, but won't get resolved easily.
So an MPO and their rural transit entity wants to cut fixed transit in support of more paratransit. Who can you align with? I think this is where I don't mean to over promise on the sort of age-friendly notion, but I think this idea of broadening the conversation, frankly, to not just be about transportation by itself, but what is it that we as a community need to be a climate resilience place for a proportionally older population. I think that becomes an important part of the problem. It may be, for example, that transit provider could be convinced that we'd still need fixed rail along with paratransit, but that some of those needs could be filled by a volunteer driver program, for example. And who could be involved in supporting that? Maybe it's your local university who has a gerontology department, or maybe it's an organization that is looking more, that is seeking to deliver services to older adults. It could be your area agency on aging, whose job is to provide services to older adults. Bring them into the conversation so that they can lend their own expertise about older adults' mobility needs. So an age-friendly framework can be a way to identify all of those various component parts that have a stake in a more age-friendly future. And I think that same organization can be real helpful in bringing conversations like that to the fore and layering on top of it climate-related risks as it pertains to mobility and transportation.
Right. Thanks. Somebody's asking, are there any thoughts about the challenges specific to aging LGBTQ Americans, and have you come across any research on the particular needs of that community?
That's an interesting question. I'll be honest, I don't have a great answer on that. I think of groups like SAGE that advocate for LGBTQ older adults and their needs, and I think ARP has done really fantastic work on thinking about what it means for LGBTQ caregivers and being able to access services to support older adults who are LGBTQ. I don't have a great answer as it pertains to climate resilience, I'm afraid. But what I would suggest those two resources, SAGE and AARP.
Thank you. You mentioned green structure earlier in your presentation. What is your idea of green structure?
I may have spoken too quickly. I meant green infrastructure. So drainage, integrating stormwater treatment, green infrastructure, catchment facilities that sort of mitigate the need for hard stormwater infrastructure by integrating green infrastructure more in a more sort of diffuse way, in a more decentralized way throughout a community. I think that adds so many benefits, not just water benefits, but has it can counteract urban heat island effect. It can create public spaces that are very desirable and meaningful for people, create opportunities for social connectedness if done well. So that was what I meant by that.
Great, thanks. How do senior centers fare with regard to climate resilience? Lots of people are there who may need this type of information, and are they being used as a way to spread information about climate and resilience?
I would venture to guess that they are not, and I think again, I'm certain that someone could come forward and say, but my senior center is fantastic at having these conversations and hosting that. And I think that's wonderful. Or that someone else could come forward and say, my senior center is also the cooling center and the sort of resilience hub for our locality. I think on balance, though, they're not, in part because of the disconnect that I talked about before. I think that, we think about who is it that provides for the needs of an aging nation. It is aging advocates. It is care providers. It is people who come out of the gerontology world. And yet there's a different set of people who are thinking about what it means to prepare for climate change. And those two silos don't often communicate, don't often talk. Part of the reason I wrote this book, frankly, is to create a little bit of a bridge between those two communities in the hopes that they might be able to, reach across the chasm, as it were, to do more of the integrated work. So again, I would love to be proven wrong on this, but my hunch is that senior centers are not currently a really robust place for that kind of conversation, but they absolutely could and really need to be.
Great. One more question. What is the correlation between the vulnerability of older adults to climate-related disasters and poverty?
I mean, there's such a huge overlap in that Venn diagram, right? I mean, when you think about one of the things I was surprised by, frankly, in looking at this report is how many older adults live at the very financial edge. I mean, at or below the poverty rate, or who spend huge disproportionate amounts of their very limited fixed income on housing. And so if you bundle those folks under a heading of poverty and what are the sort of risks that go with that, it's very easy to imagine that, they can't afford to sort of do the preparedness work that's required, whether that means stockpiling food or medications. They certainly are going to have challenges in acquiring or procuring backup power. I mean, generators are not cheap. They may not be able to maintain the steady cost of utilities on a day-to-day basis. As I shared before, something like 17% of low-income older adult-headed households went without basic necessities for a month to pay the utility bill in the last year. So that clearly puts people at risk. If people are making trade-offs between housing, shelter, and food and cooling or warmth, that creates deadly conditions inside for older adults who are already vulnerable because of, in some cases, because of chronic medical conditions. So there's a really large degree of overlap there. And I would say that also doesn't mean that older adults who aren't poor are not at risk. I think there are other risks that come from age that are, regardless of income level, that nevertheless add risk. But I do think it is acutely magnified for low-income older adults.
In terms of public health, someone raised the point that traffic everywhere is increasing and that is impacting people's health. Are there public health solutions that you're aware of that could help mitigate some of those issues?
Yeah, I guess for traffic, I think that for me, my mind goes to the solutions being more programmatic and infrastructure, more transportation investments, creating more opportunities for safe streets, for complete streets, and for bike and ped infrastructure. I think that gets you to the public health benefits. That's not to say that there isn't a role for health. I know that CDC runs a fantastic, I think it's called active, oh gosh, I'm going to get the name wrong. The title of it's a 4-letter word, Active Nation, Healthy People Initiative, something like that, that is explicit in trying to tackle that. It really tries to move public health entities at the state level to become more involved in creating safe destinations and safe pathways to destinations for people, because they know that delivers a public health benefit. So I would say it's kind of a combination there. There's a hard infrastructure and policy solution, and there certainly is an opportunity for more public health officials and public health entities to become involved in conversations about creating safe transportation for all the reasons we talked about, because it makes the individual healthier, because it provides some redundancy and some mobility for people for the day when they can't drive, and because frankly it helps to mitigate some of the carbon emissions that are contributing to climate change as well.
Right. This question has to do with the connection between the need for power and dealing with extreme weather events in terms of whether it's extreme heat or extreme cold. Are you aware of microgrids that have been built specifically to support elder communities, and what obstacles were encountered in building those or in communities in general?
Yeah, I think there's an increasing number of examples of communities that are built with renewable energy as part of the climate resilience solution, and I'll throw out a few. One of the examples I talked about in the book is called Babcock Ranch. It's in Florida. It's a market rate development on a greenfield, I'll confess, but it was designed to be powered by renewable energy, and it has backup power in place. It is entirely sort of supply is supported within the large development there. It offers an array of housing types. It encourages bike and ped alternatives within the development. It's not perfect, but I think that's an example of really doing it at scale and understanding that renewable energy has to be part of the development from the get-go. The buildings were also built to fortified standards, so they really well withstood some of the extreme events in recent years. I think it's Hurricane Ian most recently. Here in our own portfolio at National Housing Trust, we increasingly incorporate renewable energy on our affordable housing properties because we know that it provides that kind of energy security for our residents. It eliminates and begins to combat the utility cost burden that many low-income people bear. On average, I think people spend something like 2% of their income on utilities. For lower income people, that can be 6, 7, 8, 12% of their income spent on utilities. When you can replace that with a renewable system that includes backup storage, backup battery power, that really begins to chip away and make that energy more affordable and more resilient. And then I would say, again, with all of this is made more possible now than ever before because of the Inflation Reduction Act. There are incentives in the tax credit. There's a bonus solar tax credit. There's incentives that are coming down the pike in the Solar for All program that EPA will be administering in every state. There are incentives at HUD to retrofit affordable housing properties to incorporate renewable energy and battery storage. All of those are examples that are going to bring online even more evidence of use of microgrids, of rooftop solar, of community solar to fill that energy.
I have a cold, so I didn't want you to hear me coughing. Someone has provided the name of the CDC program is Active People and Healthy Nation, and you can get more information at the CDC.
Thank you, friend, wherever that was. Yeah.
So I think we're going to wrap up. We've reached the end of our questions, and I just want to give you an opportunity to give us any last words of encouragement and maybe some additional information on how folks can buy your book.
Yeah, I'm sincere in saying I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about this. I do think it's one of those, well, for me, when I saw that trend line of fatalities across 20 plus years, it was something that I couldn't unsee. Once you see that pattern and once you understand the impact on older adults, it becomes an imperative to do something about it. At least that's how I felt. I hope you feel the same way, because I think it really does apply to our profession in a particularly large way. That we can solve is that connection point between climate work and aging interests. To buy the book, it is available on Amazon. It's available in some local bookstores. I'm not sure about all. But if you're interested in purchasing directly from Island Press, I would encourage that. They're a nonprofit publisher and love to support them in their business. And you can get 20% off there by using Arigoni as a discount code. So please consider purchasing the book and tell your friends about this topic as well. So thank you again.
Thank you. This concludes our webinar, Climate Resilience for an Aging Nation. I'd like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Danielle for joining us today and sharing her work on this very important issue. I agree, it's very timely and very important for all planners. Thank you to everyone who attended and to John Coleman, who helps us keep these webinars running smoothly. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. When you exit today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience. All attendees will also receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation for your use in claiming any other continuing education credit. Keep an eye on your email inbox for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network. Thank you for joining us today and have a great day.